First of all, good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Mooney, obviously, and I'm really honored to be here today with y'all. Before I begin, I do want to take a moment to thank the folks at the college and to thank the individuals who recommended and ultimately nominated the ShortBus as a common book for y'all. But I want to put my thanks to those individuals in a context, because I think they did a very cool thing by nominating a book that was written by a 30-year-old punk. That is a very cool thing. But more important than that, I think they really nominated a book that breaks a silence that is deafening within the discourse that surrounds kids with learning disabilities and special needs. Let me explain what I mean by that term. You know, there's a lot of big old voices that talk about kids like me. There's a drug company called Pfizer that makes $1 billion off medicating kids like me. There's all sorts of PhDs who earn tenure by studying kids like me. No disrespect to present company, obviously. and there's all sorts of products out there to fix kids like me. But guess who has no voice, who is silenced in that whole process? The people who live the experience. But the ShortBus is a book that was really designed to break that silence. It's the voice of lived experience. It's the voice of people who rode the ShortBus, grew up within special education. It's the voice of real people. And I think it's a very cool thing and a courageous thing that a college of education would validate the voice of lived experience and present it to their student body. So if you're going to join me in giving them a round of applause for doing that, I would be grateful for that. Right on. Thank you. Okay, so my time with this group today is pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward. I want to give a context to my work, and I want to give a context to our conversation. But then I really want to spend our time together hearing from you, hearing your thoughts, your comments, your ideas, and really engage in a dialogue or discourse around what this book may have brought up in you. But first, I have to give a context to my work and my time here with you. And the best context for me to give is really the context that was given in my brief introduction, and that is the juxtaposition and the stark difference between my early education and my higher education. Because the ShortBus is really a memoir. It's a memoir of my experience of being one of those kids. You know, y'all know any of those kids? Well, that was me. You know, I was one of those kids who had such a hard time sitting still that I grew up chilling out with the janitor in the hallway, right? I was one of those kids who had such a hard time keeping his mouth shut in middle school that I grew up on a first-name basis with Shirley, the receptionist in the principal's office, you know? I was one of those kids who had such a hard time learning to read, and specifically a torturous time reading out loud, that I spent all of high school hiding in the bathroom to escape reading out loud with tears streaming down my face. You know, I didn't learn to read until I was 12 years old. I was labeled learning disabled or dyslexic in 4th grade. I was labeled ADHD in 5th grade, which stands for Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. I was placed in special education that same year in 5th grade into a segregated special education program with a segregated form of transportation that is federally funded. Most of us don't realize that, called the ShortBus. And I dropped out of school for a year in 6th grade. That year when I dropped out of school, 12 years old, I had a plan for suicide. When I re-enrolled in school at the age of 14, I had a guidance counselor tell me that I had a 50-50 chance of graduating from high school. Halfway through high school, that guidance counselor told me that people like me end up flipping burgers for a living. And when I finally graduated from high school, that guidance counselor told me that I would be lucky to flip burgers because people like me end up in jail. So it goes without saying that neither one of those very hopeful prophecies came to pass in my life. Opposed to flipping burgers, as was mentioned in my introduction, I graduated from Brown University, which you may or may not know is an Ivy League university, with, of all things, an honors degree in English literature, right? I've done many, many things in my life, but I have never flipped burgers and I've never been in jail. So my job and my work is often about answering the question that I'm asked all the time when people hear about a story like that. And it's a very honest question. It's a valid question. And the question is, Jonathan, what changed? The question is, Jonathan, how could you possibly go from a 6th grade dropout who could not read at 12 years old to Brown University? What drugs did you take? And where can I buy some, right? It's a very, very valid question, okay? But my work has been about answering that question. And it does not involve the miracle of pharmaceuticals, I promise you that. It involves a much deeper answer. And it's a question that I've spent the last 10 years of my life in 2 different books, in thousands of presentations, trying to answer. Not just for myself, but also trying to answer for all of those kids like me who are out there in schools today. And what I want to do now is give you the highlights of the answer to that question. What in my life facilitated that change, and what I think can facilitate that change for my brothers and sisters who have to ride that short bus to school, both literally and often metaphorically. So I just want to talk briefly about 3 big ideas that really facilitated my journey. They're really the essence of my work. I think they're the essence of the short bus, at least from a big picture perspective. 3 ideas, really. Number 1, I want to talk a little bit about the social construction of disability. I want to talk a little bit about what that means, because that's a fundamental part of my work. It's a fundamental part of everything I do, and it's a fundamental consciousness that allowed me to go from the kid who hid in the bathroom to the person in front of you. Secondly, I want to talk a little bit about the deficit model when it comes to our pedagogical practices for kids like me and the damage that it does. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about how we can replace a medical model or a medical metaphor for people with cognitive and physical differences and really adopt a diversity paradigm. Because those 3 ideas are really the essence of my journey and the essence of my book. So let me start with the first, and I'll just touch on these briefly, and we can dialogue about them. Number 1, the social construction of a disability. The best way to get into that concept is to go back to that question that people ask me all the time. Because embedded in the question of, Jonathan, how did you go to Brown University, is a tacit assumption that for Jonathan Mooney to go to Brown University, he fixed himself, right? That Jonathan Mooney had something inherently wrong with him, and to facilitate a journey of change, he fixed himself. You know, I'm asked all the time, Jonathan, how did you overcome dyslexia, right? That implies that dyslexia is something to be overcome, some intrinsic problem. But the reality is, I did not overcome dyslexia in my life. No, dyslexia is value neutral. It only becomes a problem in certain contexts, right? When I was a soccer player as a kid, it wasn't problematic. It was a gift then, right? It only becomes a problem when we value reading and writing above all else. I didn't overcome dyslexia. What I overcame was dyslexia, okay? That's what I overcame, right? To be honest with you, what I overcame was not something intrinsically wrong with me. I overcame the way that I was treated. That's what I overcame, you know? I overcame the fact that I was called stupid throughout most of my education. That's really what I overcame. You know, I overcame the fact that we define intelligence in a very narrow way, right? And then we track based on that narrow definition. What I overcame was growing up in the stupid reading group. Who remembers the stupid reading group when they were growing up, right? Let me say it differently, because we didn't actually call it the stupid group, right? We had the blackbirds over here, we had the bluebirds over here, and then over in the annexed building, right? You had the sparrows, you know? Ever hard to tell, though, which group was the smart group and which group was the stupid group? Not hard to tell, right? Tracking is alive and well in our schools. Let me put it this way. When I was growing up, everybody knew that my group was the stupid group because my group was a bird that did not fly, okay? It was an ostrich and it ran quickly, you know? And I was chilling out with C-Spot Run and everybody knew that the condors were the smart group because the condors were reading War and Peace, okay? I overcame the stigma of associating reading with intelligence. I overcame the tracking that came from that. In short, I didn't overcome something wrong with my brain. I overcame the way that I was treated. And that's a fundamentally different way to think about people with disabilities. You know, if you look at a lot of the longitudinal research studies of maybe a paraplegic, their happiness quotient is no different from the rest of us. They've normalized their physical experience. What is a detriment to their life is not their physicality. What's a detriment to their life is the fact that we have inaccessible buildings. What's a detriment to their life is that public policy sometimes doesn't cover their health care needs. The problem doesn't lie within individual bodies, but the way that we treat those individual bodies. So as researchers, as potential scholars, or as teachers, as people in the field on the front lines, to see me as not somebody inherently broken, but to see me as somebody who is disempowered or disabled by our practices and by our culture, by our buildings, by our pedagogy. That's a revolutionary change for me. Now, when we make that change, right, when we really see that the problem doesn't lie in the kid or young person per se, it also opens up a change in the way that we address the problem, right? And that brings me to the second big idea of my work, right? Our common way to address the problem of disability when we think it lies inside bodies is to try to fix people, right? Right? I mean, look, when I was growing up, we pulled Jonathan out from his class to go to reading remediation. When I was growing up, we pulled Jonathan after school to go to handwriting remediation. We did all these things to fix me. But the problem is, when we fix somebody all the time, when all of our interventions are designed around somebody's problem, the message to that human being is that they're broken, right? That they're a problem. Who here has as their core sense of self that leads to a successful life the fact that you're a problem? Anybody? Who here goes through their life and is living a successful life thinking that they are fundamentally broken? Nobody in this room, you know? The deficit remediation model that looks at labels and not people, it looks at deficits and not strengths, and it looks at individual treatments and not systemic change. It robs young people with disabilities of their agency as human beings. And that's devastating. You know, I'm not here because I was fixed. I didn't fix myself. I went to Brown University, and guess what? I read in the 12th percentile. Y'all looking at somebody who reads like a 7th grader today. I've authored 2 books, one of y'all, the one which you're reading, and I spell at a 3rd grade level. I did not fix my spelling. I founded a national nonprofit organization that's all around the country, and I have the attention span of a gnat, okay? I did not fix myself. You know, the standard special education story, the standard deficit story is not my story. And if you talk to young people who survive this experience, if you talk to young people who transcend the way they're treated, they were often empowered. They were empowered by a teacher who believed in them. They were empowered by a mom who was an advocate for them. They were empowered and not fixed. And I think it really changes our practice as educators when we stop trying to fix kids and empower them. I think it changes our research questions when we stop looking at how we can fix this group of people and we start looking at what happens around those group of people, and it fundamentally changes lives. Now, last but not least, third idea, right? So disability isn't in bodies, and that changes the way that we address disability. It changes our emphasis of where disability is, away from fixing those bodies to ultimately changing what happens around those bodies. And lastly, that leads to the logical conclusion that disability shouldn't be seen through the lens of sickness or pathology or the medical model. In fact, it should be seen through the lens of diversity. That these bodies are a natural part of the human continuum of physical and cognitive diversity. You know, the barrier to that is this deeply held belief that there is a normal we all should aspire to, right? My entire identity has been constructed on the idea that there's a normal brain I should have. My entire identity has been posited as the antithesis of normal. But each and every one of us, we know here that normal is really kind of a fiction, isn't it? You know, normal's kind of like the horizon, you know? The more you chase after it, the further and further it gets, you know? The only normal people are people you don't know very well, you know? It's an artificial concept. Do you all know that the word normalcy did not enter the English language until the 1860s. We did not have a word for it. We had the ideal there was a major shift between the normal and the ideal. Because by definition, the ideal is not obtainable, right? By definition, it's out there. You can never be it. You strive for it, but you're not held accountable for obtaining it. A real shift happened in our culture, in our thinking, when we replaced the ideal with the norm, right? It coincides with the Industrial Revolution, obviously, coincides with the rise of statistics as a way to see human populations. The norm is a statistical concept, and it coincides with needing to norm an immigrant population. The 1860s, a time of immigration, right? It's a radical thing to tell a young person that normal is not a way to define themselves. You know, that normal is really a fiction. And I just want to end my brief kind of highlight conversation by telling a quick story about how it can change a kid's life to tell them that normal's the problem and not them. And this story actually comes from and is based on one of the characters who appears in the ShortBus, a young man named Kent Roberts, okay? And Kent Roberts, who's still a very good friend of mine, came into my life because he was a mentor in an organization that I started at Brown, which has grown to be a national organization called Project Eye to Eye. And Project Eye to Eye had a very simple mission and still does. It takes college kids with cognitive differences and physical differences, and it matches those young people with high school students and middle school students and elementary school students who have a similar profile. Not as tutors, not as people to fix them, but as mentors, right? Giving them an image of a positive future. Kent Roberts was one of the first mentors we ever had in our program. And I'll be honest with you, Kent Roberts, and I mean this as a compliment, is a complete freak show, okay? He has a big beard down to here. He's got long hair that comes down to his waist. He kind of looks like Jesus, you know? Let me give you an idea of how eccentric Kent Roberts was and still is to this day. When Kent Roberts was in 8th grade, he decided one day, on the first day of 8th grade, that he would stand up every single day in his class at 10 o'clock in the morning, stand up and yell, "Surprise," okay? Every day for 1 year, Kent Roberts did that. Now, it is a very valid question to say, why in God's name did they not expel Kent Roberts or institutionalize Kent Roberts? And the answer to that is the catalyst to Kent Roberts' sort of performance art piece that he called Surprise. The catalyst to that is he, that summer, had gotten a perfect score in his SAT. The summer between his 7th and 8th grade year, he got a perfect score on his SAT. And he was recruited to go to Harvard halfway through 8th grade. So he was flown from his small little Indiana town to Harvard University for an interview with the Dean of Admissions. And he showed up to this interview, and he engaged in polite conversation. And then 5 minutes into the interview with the Dean of Admissions at Harvard University, Kent Roberts pretended that his head caught on fire. He ran around the room. He doused himself with a bottle of water. He rolled on the floor, screaming in agony, and then he returned to the interview as if nothing had happened, okay? Needless to say, Kent Roberts did not get into Harvard University. He did get into Brown, which tells you a lot about Brown, right? And I will be the first to admit to you that it was suspect judgment on my part to have Kent Robert be a mentor to anybody, okay? I'll admit that. But on the first day of Project Eye, I didn't know anything about Kent's surprise. I knew nothing about Kent's background. And he was paired with a young man named Philip. This young man was labeled Asperger's and ADHD, and he was a really hurting 3rd grader. He had school phobia, which means he hid under his bed in the morning, begged his mom not to make him go. He was just a hurting kid. So Kent Roberts was Philip's mentor, and on the first day of Eye to Eye, they met, and they went over to the corner to do the sort of ice-breaking activity that we had set up. And I walked around to all the different pairs, and when I got to Kent and Philip's group, I heard Kent screaming at the top of his lungs at Philip. Screaming. He was screaming, "Philip, if you learn one thing in Project Eye to Eye, you have to learn that normal people suck. Philip, they suck." What the that's not what Jesus says, man. I mean, come on now. I am in a public elementary school. I think the cops are coming next, you know? I wanted to do Project Eye to Eye as my profession upon graduation, and there is absolutely no federal funding for an organization whose mission is to curse at children, okay? There's no dollars for that. So I go home that night, first day of Eye to Eye, first time we've ever done this. I go home that night, and I'm furious. I think Kent has destroyed Project Eye to Eye. I think to myself, Philip should try to be normal. What are you saying, don't be normal, Kent? Philip should try to be normal. That's what we're doing in Eye to Eye. So I'm furious, and I call the guy on the phone. I call Kent Roberts up from my dorm room, and I'll be honest with you, I yell at him. I yell at Kent for like 10 minutes. Why'd you say that? What were you thinking? How could you say that? Kent didn't say a word until the very end. All he said was, "It's true," and hang up the phone, right? So I'm thinking, okay, just maybe this will blow right over, right? No teacher was present, no principal was present. Wrong. Next morning, 9 a.m., I get a call from the principal of the elementary school, Principal Mary Brennan, and she respectfully summons me to her office to discuss what transpired the day before at Project Eye to Eye. So I drive to the principal's office, and I'm thinking in my head, how can I apologize for scarring this third grader? And to confirm my fears, when I get to Principal Mary Brennan's office, not only is she there, but it's also Philip's grandmother who's there, because Philip lives full-time with Grandma. And if I've learned one thing in my brief life, it is do not mess with Grandma, right? Don't even go there, you know? Because before I can sit down, Philip's grandmother, she stands up, and she points at me. She's got fire in her eyes. She points at me. She says, "What did you do to my grandson?" I said, "Nothing. It was that Kent guy, you know? I didn't do a thing." And she had tears in her eyes. And she said, "You know, for 3 years, my grandson's hid under the bed before school. For 3 years, my grandson's been in tears from our home to school, begging me to turn around and go back. But this morning, the day after Project Eye to Eye, my grandson was up early, waiting in the car, ready to go to school. What the hell did you do to my grandson?" I looked at her and I said, "Well, it was my good friend Kent Roberts." You know? And that was a transformative moment in my life, because it was a message that telling a young person normal's the problem and not them can change a life. And it changed Philip's life, but it also changed my life, you know? Kent Roberts had a different way to think about one's humanity. You know, Kent Roberts stopped trying to be normal, and he wanted to be singular, right? You know, famous photographer Diane Arbus said that she strived to be a singular individual. And what it means to think of being a singular individual means that we understand that our deficits, our quirks, even our flaws and disabilities are intrinsically linked to who we are. You can't separate those two things. That these constitute who we are. That they're intrinsically connected. You know, and that's the beauty of a neurodiverse model that sees these experiences as adding value to our human experience. That sees these experiences as an essential part of what makes us human. And when we do that, we have to be aware of many of the forces in our culture that are trying to normalize all of us, you know? There's a sickness for every human difference now in the DSM, you know? Tell me something that's different about you and I'll find a diagnosis for you, right? There's a pervasive drug culture that wants to turn seemingly natural human fallibilities, right, into chronic diseases because there's $1 billion pharmaceutical market to treat those things, right? There are professional salaries in the form of social work that are intrinsically tied to seeing other human beings as sick and broken. There are very powerful forces that have a vested interest in this industrial disability complex. And I think we need to say to ourselves, you know what? The kid in my class isn't broken. You know, my son or daughter, they're not broken. We need to say to ourselves, my research subjects, they're not broken. They embody part of human diversity. And they deserve to be celebrated, not despite their differences, but ultimately they deserve to be celebrated for their differences. So that's the essence of my work. Celebrating young people for those differences and seeing disability as a natural and important part of human experience. So with that said, I would love to stop talking and to hear what your thoughts are, and what your questions are, and what your comments are. So, the ball's in your court. Thank you.